So, The Eye of the World, written by Robert Jordan in 1745, 1990. And I just want to preface this analysis slash review with this book is very long. It was difficult to identify exactly what to focus on in this analysis, just because I started to notice it was like sort of sprawling out of control. So this is primarily going to be a character analysis. It's and maybe a theme or two, but it'll primarily focus on Perrin and Egwene. The other thing is, just because the series itself is so long, it's hard to know the direction of the themes, or maybe some of the themes aren't even involved in the story yet, so it's hard to know exactly how they're affecting the story, the plot, the characters' decisions, and whatnot. So the story is going to start with a prologue, and it's going to tell this old history of pretty much two gods battling it out. But then it's going to jump right down into chapter 1, and here we're introduced to Rand and Tam. They're walking down the road. They're in this rural area, 2 rivers, and so they're pretty much like farmers. They tend to their own land, and they're currently bringing casks of brandy for an upcoming Beltane festival. And one of the first lines we get about Rand is that he's stubborn, and it references this is similar to most inhabitants of 2 rivers, and that he doesn't really like to feel as though he's prodded into doing things. So as they reach the town, we meet a group of people called the Congers. They're sort of like the town ruffians, the town dissolutes, maybe that's a little too harsh. They're a little rough. And then we meet a few other citizens, and then another main character, Matt, is going to show up. So while Rand is trying to unload barrels with his father, Tam, these casks of brandy, into the inn, Matt tries to lure him away with some mischievous prank. You can tell once again here, Rand is torn, and I think this is a character trait of his, sort of indecision. But he ultimately helps his father, and he ends up recruiting Matt to help him unload the barrels as well. A few more things happen, and then we're introduced to like Matt's brother, who's similar to Matt. They're both kind of puckish. And then we're introduced to another main character, Moraine. And with this interaction, we get a very clear sense of class in this story. So the whole time Matt and Rand are speaking with Moraine, they're stammering through their speech the whole time. They're nervous. And it's not just the reader that gets that sense. It's obvious to the characters in this rural, isolated town. But that, I guess this theme's not really played on too much in this story. Then there's this creepy incident with a raven, and then we're introduced to another character, Peyton Thane. He brings the news to this isolated insular area. And I don't know why they don't just watch their 24-hour news channels like we do, but this is how they get their news. And he's a very entertaining character. I was definitely endeared to him at the beginning. His grotesqueness is pretty interesting, especially when you learn what he becomes later. Then we're introduced to another main character, Perrin, when he comes up, and we're given like an obvious physical description that allows him to stand out, right? He's buff, he's a blacksmith. But you also get the sense that he's a little more chill. He's very courteous. He's walking through the crowd trying to find his friends, and he's running into people, and he's very apologetic about it. He has this sense of maybe self-consciousness about him, or this awkwardness in his own body around people. And just overall, he's very careful and terse in speech, complete opposite of Matt. And there's a moment that showcases this immediately where Matt starts speaking of some wild fancies, and Perrin, the first thing he does is suspiciously looks to Rand to confirm, because I think they both know Matt is very impulsive and gullible. Another interesting scene that I think somewhat relayed the beginnings of a theme, where you have Rand yelling, and like they're trying to talk to each other because everyone's yelling to Peyton Thane, and they're yelling to each other too. Just the cacophony of this crowd, and then everyone's silent and Rand's just left yelling, and it is pretty funny. But Rand is embarrassed, so are his friends, and you get this sense that they're worried that Peyton Thane thinks of them as children or childish. And right there's this sense of how does an adult act? Like, what is it that an adult does? And I do imagine that this will somewhat intersect with Rand's stubbornness, because I think his stubbornness sort of derives from the fact that whenever he gets prodded into doing something, he doesn't really want to do it, and oftentimes that like manifests in this character trait of indecision. And I think maybe that is his sort of childish trait that he has. Instead of accepting responsibility dutifully, he sort of, thrusts it away. And then right after this, we get another interaction between Rand, Perrin, and Mat. And we see this similar theme of who Mat is arise. So he's very impulsive. Once again, he's gullible, but he's just very recklessly talkative. And he's just standing there regaling Rand and Perrin. And they're giving him a hard time for just credulously believing and accepting these goofy conspiracy theories. And there is a sense that when they're all three together, it's sort of up to Perrin and Rand to keep Mat's impulsive tendencies in line. And then in pretty quick succession, we're introduced to three more characters. I would say the first of which is 98. So she's very vain, staunch, barbed in her attitude towards men. But that's probably an understatement. She's like this to everyone. She'll very much twist words with people with asperity and rapid insults. And as she approaches the three, it just comes up and makes some rude, insulting remark and silences Mat. And then she leads into her conversation with what is a belittling and I would say embarrassing remark about how Rand is interested in Egwene. And this is in front of everyone, so he's embarrassed too. She just has this obvious supercilious authority complex. The next is Egwene. She's much more friendly and affable than the waspish Nynaeve. Rather than twist words, she seems to read into words that often puts her at odds with people. It does seem she does interpret them correctly, though. Egwene is training to be a wisdom. She's the protege of Nynaeve. And I would say, though she enforces and adheres to the rules in the same manner of Nynaeve, who is the wisdom who has this leadership position, rules seem to have less of a overall effect on her personality, right? She has this adventurous curiosity that often seems to overtake her propriety or her sense of tradition. And I would argue in this story, she's probably the most interesting character of all, except outside of Perrin. I think those two, Egwene and Perrin, are the most fascinating characters in this story for me. And right away, as we realize, as Nynaeve insinuated, Egwene is interested in Rand and he, her. But I've got the sense that hers is a little more from the heart. His seems a little more matter of fact. Kind of like, I guess this is what I have to do. I guess this is how it's supposed to be. But I think the weight of the marriage decision weighs on him. And he feels like he's being prodded into doing this, right? But I do wonder, is that kind of a childish mentality that he has? Maybe he is right that Paden Vane was looking at him sort of like a child still. Plus, if you think about it, Mat and Rand were hanging out with Mat's little brother for a long time. So maybe they do have these younger tendencies rather than hanging out with the adults, meeting with the adults. And then an interesting point is that Rand, obviously, is very uncertain about what he wants in life. But it's interesting if you think of it, because in this story, time is very cyclical, and history has this sort of ever-present feel. It's like always wrapped up in the present. It's interesting to speculate that, especially as you learn later on, that Rand is in fact a foreigner. And I do wonder if maybe his tradition that's sort of come to him through history somewhat conflicts with the notion of tradition of the Two Rivers folks. And then they sort of disperse and it's left with just Rand and Egwene. And this was a pretty interesting scene, somewhat revealing for both Rand and Egwene. He blurts out, "What are you dancing?" And I get the sense that maybe he's kind of filling this role of the dreamer in this story. I hesitate to call him like the adventurer because I think Egwene very much fills that role, but he very often is just thinking of things and just like blurts something else out. So after Rand asks Egwene to dance, she agrees to it. And then he's trying to get her attention, he's trying to ask her another question, and then he just has this, you can tell, this like revelation, because he suddenly realizes that he and Egwene are both reaching marriageable age on the same day. This is sort of what this Beltane festival symbolically represents. They're reaching this marriageable age. He's just immediately nervous. He's like stricken. And suddenly, after asking this question, he views the braid, which signifies that she's come of age, as a viper. Right, so he's terrified. And then right after thinking this, he just makes this sort of blunt remark, like, well, yeah, you know, we don't have to get married, right? And to which Egwene replies, yeah, but we actually don't ever have to. And then Rand is once again unsure, you know, wait, what do you mean never? That's not what he meant, right? And she's like, tells him she's thinking about being a wisdom. And if she becomes a wisdom, right, the wisdoms don't get married. Instead of, you know, hearing her point out, he kind of mocks her. And he makes the joke, oh, what, are you just going to be an apprentice to Nynaeve your whole life and never become a true wisdom? And then she's like, well, I could just leave, dumbass. And he's like, oh, like he had never considered this. And then he's mad at her again because now he doesn't want her to leave. Even though just a little while ago, he was like thinking about leaving. And then they sort of come to odds. Their conversation definitely ends on an argumentative note. And so after she's like, I'll leave, now he's sort of hurt. He's kind of confused. He's worried that now he'll never see her again. So like, he wants to always be around her. He doesn't want to never see her again. He wants to leave, but he doesn't want her to leave. And then he makes this comment where he tells her, you shouldn't think that because I know the difference between daydreaming and reality. And then she gets mad at him. And it's like, well, yeah. And she replies, well, and I don't. And he's like, oh, and now he thinks that she's reading into too much into his words, but that's like exactly what he was implying. So I'm not sure what he meant here. He's like very confused and he's very unable to make decisions and just commit to something. He fights these traditions. He's extremely stubborn. He seems to want to passively rebel against the rules and force, but doesn't really know what other options are available. He doesn't know what he would do if he would leave. He would be without Egwene. He doesn't know what to do if he wouldn't get married. He would be without Egwene. She might get with someone else. And yeah, so it seems like the way I would characterize it is that very often his stubbornness just manifests as indecision, as being non-committal. Egwene picks up on this. And then the next character we're going to be introduced to is the Gleeman Tom. And as soon as they see this cat, they're just overwhelmed. They're enthralled. They're all effusive, just billowing with childlike bliss, even Egwene. And I think that's what separates her from Nynaeve too. She's just as excitable as the others her age. We're not dealing with topics that are very serious. Nynaeve is very much serious all the time. And Tom seems down to earth. He's very well spoken, shrewd. He's also blunt. He has this cloak with multicolored patches all over it. And I think it represents sort of his cosmopolitan attitude, his cosmopolitan perspective. That they don't have anything like this. And there's this funny scene where Matt is boasting, right, recklessly just boasting to Tom about how far and wide they've traveled. And Tom's like listening and like, wait, like I can see the hill like that you're talking about. That's not that far, dude. But he's doing it in a way that's like more amusing. He's kind of picking on Matt. And Egwene and Rand catch on, and Egwene shuts it down. And personally, I really liked all these scenes. I really liked all the character introductions. I liked their interactions, some of their arguments, conversations, their humor. It was very amusing, and it was very easy to distinguish everyone from everyone else. And I wanted to see what was going to happen with the whole Beltane Festival. But then everything gets put on hold because the trolls attack. They pretty much raid their house, and Tam fights them off for as long as he can. And so obviously he's something completely different. He's like pulls his sword out, he's like chopping things down. And there's this tense scene where Rand helps him escape and is like forced to carry him all the way back into town while being hunted by this army, this squadron of troll goons. And then to jump ahead to chapter 11, there was one scene that was jarring for me. Moraine, digs her staff into the ground and starts giving this really heroic speech to the Congers and all these people who would challenge her. And in a way, it makes sense. This community, or elements within this community, have a certain xenophobic tendency. Maybe xenophobic's harsh, but anti-foreigner tendency. And so I understand why she's explaining this. There's no character involvement in it. It was just this very disinterested, heroic speech. And yeah, I don't know. It just felt too cringy. I think Jordan tried to pull a fast one and prove he can make us sit through a lecture, but it didn't work. So they pretty much the same day, flee the village because this squadron and patrol of savage trollgoons and their Mirdraw leaders are still chasing them. So as they leave, it gets pretty tense. They eventually take refuge. Moraine tells Egwene, once they've stopped and they're resting for the night, that, hey, you can be an Aes Sedai. You're able to summon the One Power. I can see it. And just real quick, the One Power is a magical substance that is channeled by the Aes Sedai to cast magic in this story. And the Aes Sedai are like a powerful magical guild composed only of women that really have a hand in everything, particularly politics. And so she's telling Egwene, you can do this. And she gets her to perform a test, so she wants her to create this little light. And Rand just doesn't believe it. First off, I think he's jealous that she's going to be an Aes Sedai, and he thinks that's immediately going to preclude them from ever being together. But I think he's so distrustful too of Moraine. He thinks that she has all the ulterior motives the whole time. I just think he thinks, oh, she's lying. He's certain that, oh, Moraine just lied to Egwene. And I think he wants to see her as the Two Rivers girl, but at the same time not that girl. And he too wants to leave Two Rivers, but at the same time he sort of always wants to stay. And just to re-emphasize this one point, it's easy to notice that everyone in this party, with the exception of Egwene, completely distrusts the Aes Sedai. Egwene is far more open to adventure and new things, travel. And she immediately accepts being an Aes Sedai without reservation. She even quickly begins to accept the Aes Sedai as an institution. And considering how much every other member of the group is wary, distrustful, just detests, in the case of 98, the Aes Sedai, this is a very unusual point of view to possess from this little town. And then slowly as they're traveling on their way to the city of Berlin, Rand goes from thinking that, oh, we were going to be together in a resigned sort of way, like at the beginning, to lamenting that they were supposed to be together, that it's past tense, that all this is over. And I think that's where we're going to end this video. I think there's going to be one more that's like review and analysis, and then there will be two more after that, so the third and the fourth one, that'll be really heavily into just analysis.